Our first presenter, Seren, is a part of the Good Food Institute Europe, where she's working to build a strong, well-funded scientific community in the sustainable protein space. Seren, I'd like to welcome you to introduce yourself and kick off the event. For all of those who have questions for Seren, you can write them in the chat during or after her presentation. So Seren, you're free to start sharing.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And yeah, thank you very much broadly to ProBiome for organizing this conference. I'm super excited about, I'm sure, many of the people who are attending, but also the incredible lineup you have. And it's just so exciting to see more and more events like this taking place across Europe and globally too. So yeah, I'm going to be introducing the 3 pillars of future food. So focusing on these kind of 3 alternative pillars: plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation. Briefly, I'm Seren Kell. I'm the Science and Technology Manager at the Good Food Institute Europe. And then without further ado, let's move on. Okay, so yeah, let's jump into the agenda. What am I going to introduce today? So firstly, I'll give a brief introduction to GFI for those of you who aren't aware, and just an overview of where we sit in the ecosystem, what it is that we're trying to do as an organization. I'll then really dive into the why of alternative proteins, although I imagine many of you here, lots of it won't be news to you, but just to really overview the key drivers for why we think this is such an important space. Then I'll move forward into actually going through plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation. So what it is that we actually mean by these technologies, kind of giving a high-level definition, which hopefully will set the framing for many of the other talks you'll be getting and many of the real deep dives you'll get into each production pillar. I'll go through just very briefly at a high level the commercial and investment landscape, and also the science and technology and the kind of key innovation R&D needs that we see that really need to kind of be addressed in order for this ecosystem to move forwards. And then finally at the end, there should be time, 5 or 10 minutes or so, for a Q&A. My understanding is if you want to ask questions, do feel free to just drop them in the chat as I go, and then we can address them at the end, or feel free to just wait till the end. Okay, so GFI broadly is a global network of non-profit organizations. So we are 100% philanthropically funded. GFI Europe is one affiliate of the GFI Global Network. So GFI Europe, we are an international NGO. And broadly speaking, across all of the global network of GFI affiliates, we are helping to build a more sustainable, secure, and just food system by transforming the way that meat is produced. In terms of how we do this, we have 3 core programmatic areas that we focus on at GFI, which is then supported by our philanthropic and our communications teams. As part of these 3 areas, firstly, science and technology. We also work with policymakers, and thirdly, businesses, in order to advance plant-based, fermentation and cultivated meat, and specifically to make them delicious, affordable and accessible across Europe. There's some more detail on the slide in terms of specifically what we do within this programmatic areas. So within science and technology, we really work directly with scientists to develop, fund and promote open access research on alternative proteins. From the policy perspective, we work with governments to advance investment into R&D and infrastructure, as well as to ensure there is fair regulation and legislation. And finally, our corporate engagement work is really us enabling and supporting the food industry to make delicious and affordable plant-based meat available across Europe, and also to prepare the sector for the arrival of cultivated meat. Okay. So focusing on the why, the kind of first question, why is it that we think this matters, and why is it that we think that, that people should be dedicating the resources that they are to alternative proteins? So I won't focus on this for too long because, as I mentioned, I imagine none of this stuff is particularly surprising to most of you who are here. You've self-selected because you think this is a really exciting and important space, but just kind of going over again the scale of the problem we're trying to address. So the key question here really is, how is it that we are going to feed 10 billion people by the year 2050? And not only that, but to do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely. At present, the global meat industry produces about 350 million megatons of meat annually. And by 2050, that is going to look more like 500 million megatons a year. At the moment, alternative proteins is barely a rounding error of this market. So we are facing a huge challenge over the next 3 decades. As many of us know, the conventional meat production system imposes severe externalities on this planet, on our planet. We have them broken down here according to sustainability, efficiency, and safety. So looking specifically at sustainability to start with, industrial animal agriculture is responsible for at least 14% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Moving on to efficiency, it uses 75% of agricultural land, but provides only a third of the global protein supply. So purely from an efficiency perspective, we know that there just isn't enough land to feed the 10 billion people through scaling up our current food system. Looking from a safety or a public health perspective, this last 2 years has put a spotlight on the role of animals in global pandemics. So, for example, the United Nations Preventing the Next Pandemic report listed 7 key drivers of another future pandemic, and 2 of those, the first 2, were associated with industrial animal agriculture. But this isn't just about pandemics. There's also the question of antimicrobial resistance. So we know, for example, that animal agriculture is the #1 user of medically important antibiotics globally. And this cannot be understated, that the kind of ticking time bomb this presents for public health in the future. None of this is news. We have seen warnings of this in the media for years. Industrial animal agriculture's impact is not a secret. As you can see here, I've just got a few headlines, but you know, there are dozens and hundreds of these every day, week, year. Despite that, moving on to the next slide, despite that, global meat consumption is at the highest it's ever been. And not only that, it is projected to increase even further in the next decades. So it's clearly the case that simply telling people about the harms of agriculture just does not slow down meat consumption. Even though people now are much more aware about the impact of the food they eat, we haven't actually seen this reflected and played out in terms of an appropriate change in diet. And as you can see, it really is just going up and up and up over the following years. So clearly there is something about meat where consumption tracks with wealth, and therefore this consumption is just going up and up and up. That being said, why is it that that's true? Looking at consumer behavior over the previous years that looks into kind of decision making and why consumers choose to eat what they do, it is very clear that the key foundational drivers, or the things which have the biggest impact on people's decision making when they decide what to eat, really are these 3 considerations of taste, price, and convenience. So these fulfill those immediate needs and are the primary drivers of people's decision making. Beyond that, there are these evolving drivers, and that's where people kind of take into account questions around the environmental impact or health or animal welfare. But as you can see from the schematic, these really are secondary. And even for those people where it is true that they make their decisions on the basis of these factors, it's rare. This is not everyone. So we have to find something which competes on taste, price, and convenience. And this really is where alternative proteins comes in and why we think it's so important. What we need to do is promote alternative ways to produce the meat, eggs, and dairy that are actually competitive on these fronts of taste, price, and convenience, as well as having none of the problems associated with animal agriculture. The kind of real point here is we don't need to kind of change how people make their decisions or change how they think about food or meat. We just have to find a way to create their meat, eggs, and dairy by making them either directly from plants, cultivating them from cells, or producing them by fermentation. And it goes without saying that alternative proteins are just much better for the environment, for public health, animal welfare, and food security, these various considerations I outlined before, either because they've completely removed animals from their process or greatly, greatly minimized them in the process. Okay, so let's actually talk about these 3 pillars of food. What are they and how do they work, essentially? I'm just going to go through some definitions again to kind of frame the rest of this presentation, but also, like I mentioned, it should kind of set in context the different incredibly kind of cool innovations you're seeing from different companies throughout the rest of the conference. So putting some definitions in place. Plant-based meat is, in essence, products that are biomimicking meat using plants as the building blocks. So they look, taste, and cook like conventional meat, but they are really derived from plants. Cultivated meat is distinguished from this importantly because it actually is identical to animal meat at the cellular level. So it therefore provides the same sensory and nutritional profile as conventional meat because it actually comprises the same cell types and 3D structure as meat from an animal. Finally, on the far right-hand side here, we have fermentation. which refers to the use of microorganisms to either produce protein directly or to produce ingredients which then enhance our ability to innovate with either plant-based or cultivated meat. And just to dive a little bit deeper into fermentation, at GFI, we generally categorize fermentation within 3 sub kind of buckets or divisions. So traditional fermentation, biomass fermentation, and precision fermentation. I'll just briefly explain those to you as well, because it might come up at some point during the conference. Traditional fermentation is really what we've seen for thousands and thousands of years, where microbes are used to convert plant-based ingredients into products which are more exciting, which help them keep for longer or have various other kind of functional changes. So beer, yogurt, tempeh, cheese, these are all examples of traditional fermentation. Biomass fermentation is where we are kind of leveraging the extremely rapid growth of microbes and the high protein content of many microbes, and the final product is the microbe itself. So, for example, the corn brand that was developed in the UK, Enough Foods, we're seeing many, many more exciting examples of these crop up globally and in Europe too. And this is a relatively speaking, a more recent application of fermentation. And then finally, precision fermentation is where we are using microbes as an expression platform or a production platform to produce specific ingredients, which we will then integrate either into a fermentation-driven product or into plant-based or cultivated products. So one key and well-known example of this is where Impossible Foods integrates this heme-like molecule, which is a molecule that we find in blood. This heme-like molecule, they produce it in yeast or a microbe, and then this heme goes into their plant-based burger to give it that kind of bloody, meaty taste and texture. So this is a precision fermentation. Broadly speaking, all 3 of these pillars do work together in complementary ways. And just to dive a little bit deeper into that idea, ultimately, we believe that animal product alternatives will occur along some kind of a spectrum, where in the future, we won't see these 3 production platforms as distinct industry segments, but rather as one large industry where we produce these different alternatives across the spectrum in utilizing ingredients from one or more technology. So this is why at GFI, we focus on the entire category of alternative proteins, because each production platform within it has synergistic benefits on the other one. And there's a few examples of this on the slide. So, for example, hybrid products in the center, where you might have a plant-based burger, but you could be including fat, which came from cultivating cells to produce this kind of cultivated meat or cultivated fat. Likewise, below that, we might be using precision fermentation to produce specific growth factors, which will then be used in the cell culture media during the production of cultivated meat. So those are just a couple examples, just to spotlight that it's quite likely that this industry, that the boundaries are relatively blurry between the production platforms, but all of them together can have incredible benefits and create incredible products. I just wanted to make this point here that the approach of alternative proteins and using new technologies and science to displace animals from a process is not new or unique to the meat industry. We've got various different examples of this here, from transportation, fuel and energy, food storage, and kind of even currencies or tradable wealth, where previously, when there wasn't another option, animals were the way in which we did that. So transportation, obviously we had horses and pack animals. Fuel and energy, we used to harvest whales. I think there was a certain oil in these whales, which was used to light the lamps. Livestock, obviously, we used as a form of wealth, and then we developed currency. So this just really isn't a new idea. It's a natural progression we've seen many, many times before, where more efficient and effective technologies are replacing outdated ones. And I just think it's really good to kind of keep this context in mind and not to see this as some incredibly new thing which humanity hasn't done before. This is very much what humans do as part of innovation and development. Okay, so let's look at the commercial investment landscape. I won't dive too deeply into this, but I just want to give a very high level overview to kind of anchor you to a sense of where the industry is at right now. So this is data from GFI's State of the Industry Reports 2020. We produce these every year. We'll be coming out with our 2021 ones in a couple of weeks or a few weeks or so. I really recommend you go and find these online. They're completely free to download, and they give this incredible snapshot of where the industry is at right now, as well as the key kind of scientific breakthroughs which have taken place and the main kind of commercial changes that have happened over that year. So just looking at 2020 now, we're looking into specifically in this graph, the total number of private capital invested into different alternative protein companies. So what you can see is that in 2020, the total invested across the industry was $3.1 billion. That's broken down by production platforms. So you can see that a majority of that went to plant-based companies, but there was also really significant investment in fermentation and cultivated too. And I think, again, it's worth stepping back and just looking at this and thinking how exciting that is. It's just so encouraging that consumer response has actually been as strong as it has been, in spite of both premium pricing, but also the fact that we really haven't exhaustively explored the range of possibilities from a pricing perspective, but also the sensory attributes too. And it implies that there really is the potential for strong growth ahead as these products improve and the supply chain scales. Diving a little deeper into plant-based alternative proteins and where that sits in the market. So we have here US and global market projections for plant-based meat from various different sources. So as you can see, the plant-based market is projected to reach at least 100 billion, if not 370 billion by the year 2035, coming from these various different banks making these projections, so UBS, JP Morgan, and so on. Looking at fermentation, again, this is data from 2020. What was really exciting was this expanding alternative protein startup landscape that was happening over that year. So the number of companies across 2020 increased by 16%. Of these, there were 13 startups dedicated specifically for alternative proteins, along with many new suppliers as well, focused on specific ingredients. Much of this innovation we're seeing across the US and Israel, but I have kind of put a spotlight here on some exciting European startups that we've seen really come to the fore over the last few years. Broadly speaking, you can look at the graph and see that the rate of growth is increasing in recent years, and actually about 4 in 5 alternative protein fermentation companies have been formed since 2015. So growth is really increasing year on year. As well as these startups that you can see here, we've also seen more than 30 other types of companies, so incumbent providers, mid-sized specialty or niche providers, developing at least a commercial initiative in fermentation-enabled alternative proteins, and also massive market leaders in this category are starting also to develop either an initiative or a real focus on alternative proteins. Okay, and then looking at cultivated meat. So it's a similar story with fermentation, where the number of startups has really shot up. So back in 2017, I think there were fewer than 20 dedicated startups who real full stack companies looking to develop cultivated meat. In this year, I'd say we have well over 100, with many also working on specific aspects of the production process, as well as much larger companies getting proactively involved too. If you look at the industry's production life cycle, you can see from this graph, we're starting to see a real transition to the pilot scale from around 2019, with the wave of first saleable products. So some of you may have seen in December 2020, Singapore was the first country to actually enable the sale of cultivated meat. And going on from 2022 this year onwards, we hope to see the research kind of moving towards more of a commercial scale, so demonstration scale, and also an industrial scale in the future, where ultimately the kind of production capacity will then be in the region of millions of metric tons of meat. That being said, I don't want to paint a picture that describes it all as incredibly optimistic and rosy, and that this industry is huge, and that nothing else is needed, it's going to take off by default. While it's really encouraging to see this growth in investment, and as you can see from those graphs, over time, it's very good in relative terms to previous years. It really is worthwhile to actually put it in perspective. So going back to the kind of why of alternative protein I already discussed, when we consider the drivers of global climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and the industries that can offer solutions, so on the bottom left here, the kind of real problems around transportation and also electricity and heating, and then on the right-hand side, you can see the kind of potential solutions, so electric vehicles, charging technologies, renewable energies. When you look at the role that animal agriculture plays in climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, the amount of investment going in, even in the last couple of years, is unbelievably low relative to the investment placed into other sectors. So, as noted earlier, raising livestock for food contributes over 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is actually more than we see for transportation. And yet, if you look at the invested capital on the right-hand side, we've seen 6 billion go to alternative proteins overall, and 50 billion going to electric vehicles, and over 100 billion going to renewable energies. So it's just a real disconnect in terms of the impact that the incumbent industry has on climate change versus the amount of capital that's released to address it as a climate solution and identify these alternatives. It's also worth pointing out this is just private investment. If you look at public investment, the discrepancy is even bigger. All of this is really just to say that more investment is clearly needed from both the private and the public sectors to actually enable alternative proteins to meet the potential that they can as a climate solution. In this industry, there's so much more room for additional funding and so many more low-hanging fruit and R&D kind of innovation needs that still need to be addressed, that we are right at the beginning of the innovation curve, and there is so much more that could be achieved with more recognition and funding in the public and the private sphere. And that's just the early R&D kind of challenges that need to be addressed. There's also questions around manufacturing and scale up and kind of allowing for full industrial infrastructure capacity, and all of this stuff just costs huge amounts of money, and we're not seeing that reflected in the level of capital, private and public, going into it. Okay, let's move into science and technology and actually kind of zoom deeper into some of those innovation challenges I was just mentioning there. So starting with plant-based, I'm just going to give a really high-level overview in how plant-based meat is made, and then, as mentioned, I'll dive a bit deeper into the kinds of technical challenges we think still need to be addressed through R&D. So looking at the schematic, we can separate the process for producing plant-based meat, broadly speaking, into 4 high-level steps. So first of all, starting with source selection, we need to identify the best source material. Today, this is often wheat or soy, but it really doesn't need to be. It could be a novel plant source, it could be fungi, algae, or bacteria. There's so much exciting kind of landscaping and scoping that could be done to identify better sources to use as crops, including ones which really make sense in the native or farming context of each particular jurisdiction. Moving on to optimization, we need to optimize that source so it has more of the attributes we need in the final plant-based meat product. So, for example, a higher protein content or reduced off flavors. Ingredient processing, these raw materials are then isolated from the source materials and functionalized through mechanical or chemical processes that create the optimal ingredients for the final product, which finally leads us to end product formulation and manufacturing. So this is really where art and science, so to speak, come together to combine these ingredients to create the desired taste, texture, smell, and appearance. And as I mentioned, essentially along this full length of the value chain, we really do need innovation at each of these steps to expand the market. So namely source selection, optimization, processing, and texturization. And I'll just dive a bit deeper into the kinds of science we would like to see addressing these challenges. So starting with source selection and optimization, just to make the point really that plant-based meat, the core goal is to persuade plant proteins, which are generally globular proteins, to act like animal proteins or fibrillar proteins. There are different types of sources or crops that we could be using beyond the wheat or soy that are currently being used to achieve some of these goals. So just to kind of highlight some aspects around this, crops have historically not been optimized either for their protein content overall, or even within the proteins for the specific functionality required by many plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products. So the plant-based ingredient industry really has a need for crops that are bred to exhibit lower levels of metabolites and enzymes that might negatively impact the taste, as well as to be bred for higher protein content and functionality. Well, some of these functionalities are around things like improved solubility, water binding capacity, and fat binding capacity, all of which really contribute and are important to really reach those desired sensory attributes in the final end product. Moving on to processing, I won't dwell for too long on this, but just to say that proteins are often extracted to improve their properties for a set of applications, So usually this focuses on removing components such as oil, starch, and fiber. Often this process also removes protein components too, and the type of process will determine which components are retained and which are removed. This process can either intentionally or unintentionally alter the functional and nutritional properties of the proteins in a variety of ways, so including denaturation, hydrolysis, modification, and cross-linking. So beyond this as well, there is this kind of secondary order or commercial consideration. Ingredient processing is almost always scale dependent, relying on high volumes to make up for low margins. So even as the demand for new protein flours and isolates and concentrates grows rapidly, the cost and complexity of building the right processing facilities and production and the kind of infrastructure needed can actually make ingredient production capacity really slow to materialize. So one of the highest priorities for alternative protein scaling is actually identifying new chemical, mechanical, and biological processing methods that offer a very high output quality and functionality, whilst also being inexpensive, more efficient, and compatible with a much more diverse array of crop inputs, as well as less scale dependent than the existing current processes. And finally, on the plant-based side, in terms of the new kind of innovations we think we really need to see, in addition to crop development and ingredient optimization, the final area is around innovation around the production method itself. So existing technology mainly involves some kind of combination of mixing, molding, forming, and extrusion, of which you have either high or low moisture extrusion. We are starting to see more and more exciting innovations or alternatives to this. So mechanical innovations such as 3D printing or shear cell technology, as well as biological innovation, including biofabrication and fermentation. But just to really make the point that we have barely scratched the surface of the kinds of innovations we could see on the production method and processing side. And there's just so much more work that could be done. Okay, diving a bit deeper into the science of fermentation then. And like with plant-based, I will overview some of the key research challenges we think that still need to be addressed. Fermentation as an industry, and as mentioned when I was talking about traditional fermentation, which we've had for thousands and thousands of years, it really is an industry poised for rapid growth. And there are various different reasons for this. So firstly, just looking at this first line here, it's been proven at different scales, and also it's fundamentally low cost. So it really gives reasons to give kind of hope that it can be done in an economical way. And importantly, because of this history of traditional fermentation, the food industry is familiar with it as an end product or a key ingredient. And beyond that, the key advantages or potential of fermentation are just really kind of symptoms of how fast microbes grow relative to plants or animal cells, and therefore that just brings economic and R&D benefits. So the R&D cycles are faster because they grow much quicker, and because the biomass could potentially be harvested every few hours. If you can scale, then this really lowers the supply chain volatility because the feedback loops are significantly shortened. All of that being said, although fermentation is a relatively mature platform, using it in the context of alternative proteins presents many new challenges. And as identified in our State of the Industry reports, there really are opportunities along the full stage of the value chain, which are in need of optimization. And there really are just so many areas we want to see highlighted with new research. And these are kind of broken down thematically here. So just starting with precision fermentation. So I mentioned previously, precision fermentation is where we're using the microbe as a production platform for particular ingredients, which we will then integrate into other products. We could be doing so much more around identifying different targets or different types of ingredients to produce using microbes. I mentioned already the Impossible Burger utilizing heme. We're seeing more and more exciting examples of this, where collagen, for example, is being expressed through precision fermentation, but we could be doing so much more. And again, we've really barely scratched the surface. Looking at developing new strains, this is again an area where there could be so much innovation. So this is kind of developing either new microbial strains or just working with existing strains to optimize them, and just generally promoting a robust ecosystem around this to identify the optimal pathway for producing specific targets. Moving on to feedstock optimization. So just to kind of give some context, the feedstock in the context of fermentation refers to the food or the fuel that we're feeding the microbes. So generally speaking, some kind of carbon source that the microbes consume to then produce whatever it is that we're optimizing them to produce. Optimizing the right feedstocks is incredibly important, not just from a cost perspective, but also a sustainability standpoint. So just one example, in Europe, we have Solar Foods who are using hydrogen and CO2 as the fuel source for microbes. Alternatively, we've seen other research projects or companies who are using waste side streams from other industries. All this kind of stuff is just holds such incredible potential from a biocircularity or a sustainability point of view, but there's still just a huge amount of work, investment, and real kind of coordination needed to maximize this potential. Looking at process design and manufacturing, I think this is an incredibly important point, specifically with respect to fermentation. So generally speaking, high demands from other industries has created, so just to give some examples, biofuels, pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, the people who already have a lot of the infrastructure, which will be applied to fermentation. But the high demand from these other sectors has put a real premium on global fermentation capacity. So one of the overarching challenges is that all of this existing infrastructure, the R&D tools, the workforce experience, the various inputs, they come from these other industries which tend to be very high margin life sciences industries, and therefore have a real emphasis on sterility that is just over-engineered and overly expensive for food production purposes. So one specific example of this, many bioreactors for pharmaceuticals are disposable, since single use is easier than just sterilizing between batches. Whereas by contrast, food grade fermentation, we would really kind of preferably for cost reasons have multi-use cleanable between batches. There just isn't the same standard for sterility as there is in the pharmaceutical space. And finally, just looking at formulation and product development, there really is just so much room for innovation around different ways to create these either as ingredients or as components as part of other products and endpoints. Okay, and then moving on to the science and technology of cultivated. So I'm going to give a super high level overview for how cultivated meat is produced. Broadly speaking, it borrows a lot of technology from other industries. So for example, tissue engineering or the cell therapies industry, and it goes essentially running from left to right along this diagram. So starting with the sample, a small biopsy of cells is obtained from an animal. Obviously, it would need to be a species relevant animal, so chickens, cows, pigs, etc., seafood. And these cells are then expanded or proliferated in a bioreactor or cultivated. So they're just encouraged to grow, replicate, divide, and in an exponential manner. In order to do this, their food is what we call cell culture medium, which is a liquid that contains all the various carbon sources, growth factors, amino acids, nutrients, everything they need to grow, as well as needing waste products removed, so carbon dioxide, lactate, various other molecules. Once we have a sufficient number of these cells, the conditions are then changed in some way that triggers the cells to differentiate or specialize into the cell types that make up meat. So muscle cells, fat cells, and connective tissue cells that would be the dominant cell types. That's the process at a super high level. At the end, the specialized cells are extracted in some way, purified, and then integrated into a final product. This process overall would take somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks, which kind of, it goes without saying, is just far, far faster and more efficient than the time required to raise an animal for slaughter. So we're essentially not relying on growing a whole animal to then extract a small proportion of their muscle or biomass for food. We are just skipping the middleman and taking what we want and growing that in this incredibly efficient environment. In terms of the core research areas or innovation needs around cultivated meat, these can be broken up into 4 categories. I won't dwell on these for too long, but broadly speaking, just to give a high-level overview, cell line development. So I mentioned in the previous slide, we start with the sample of cells. Generally speaking, it's really helpful to create a cell line, which is essentially a bank of those cells, which is immortal and stable, and that you can keep going back to and ensure consistency in your product over time. We need far more of these cell lines. We need them in the right species. We need them with the right muscle types. And there's so many tissue types, and there's so much more research that needs to go into actually developing these in an open access way for researchers and companies. Secondly, there's the cell culture media. I mentioned this already. That is essentially the liquid that the cells grow in. And there's huge innovation which is needed around kind of getting the media which is the most efficient and can trigger the cells to differentiate at the right time. But also that is just much cheaper, because at present, a large proportion of the cost of growing cultivated meat is around the ingredients for the cell culture media. Looking at scaffolding, cells, especially mammalian cells, are what we call adherent, which means they want to grow connected to and communicating either with each other or with some kind of solid surface. So you need scaffolding elements which the cells will adhere to, which will allow them to then grow, replicate, specialize, differentiate. There are various different exciting approaches that researchers are doing to innovate around scaffolding, including developing edible scaffolds which allow you to create complicated 3D structures to get whole cut products like steaks or chicken breasts. But unsurprisingly, for such a new research field, there's still so much more that could be done here. And then finally, looking at bioprocess design, that's questions around the bioreactor. So the tanks that the cells grow in, as well as the overall process from an efficiency perspective around moving cells between the different stages of that process. And again, there's huge amounts of research which could go into optimizing that process. Just on the cell culture media, just an interesting stat here. So even at the bench scale, so even in kind of early stage laboratories, you can achieve significant cost reduction by kind of innovating with the cell culture media and producing different growth factor variants in-house. But on that point specifically, we have identified various other specific approaches that can be taken that enable producers to really move down that cost curve. So it is just clearly not a secret that today, at the current scale at which it's produced, cultivated meat is still much more expensive to produce than conventional meat. And these recent different results from various open access techno-economic assessments really hone in on these 4 different research approaches, which can help bring down the costs. So metabolic engineering, so that's things like making the cells more tolerant to their waste products or inhibiting catabolites and CO2, as well as making them happy to exist and thrive at increased cell densities. Reducing the media input costs, that's things like identifying alternatives to expensive growth factors, or even alternatives to the amino acids. So, for example, sourcing them from cheap plant hydrolysates. There just does not exist a supply chain for this yet, and we really need there to be. Efficient media utilization. So that could be working with the cells and innovating around cells so they either need less medium, or working with the bioreactors and the production systems to allow efficient recycling of the media, so you're not having to use as much overall. And finally, capex reduction strategies. So this will be especially important because the largest cost driver once cultivated meat is produced at industrial scale really is the ability to buy this incredibly expensive equipment outright for these startups. So yeah, things like bioreactors. Okay, so just briefly to talk a bit about what GFI is doing to try and facilitate the industry and address some of these innovation challenges. So firstly, just to draw attention to our Advancing Solutions in Alternative Proteins database. That's something that GFI published after interviewing people across the full length of the value chain, including over 150 supply chain people, and as mentioned, all the way from R&D upstream through to distribution. And what it is, it's kind of maps the different challenges and solutions throughout the chain, highlighting the biggest and kind of bottleneck or kind of technically limiting opportunities which can be done either in the research space, in the government or company labs, and across the full length of the value chain. And in the bottom right-hand side here, I just wanted to briefly draw attention to our competitive research grant program. Over the first 2 years of this, we awarded over 7 million to 35 research teams around the world looking to address some of these different challenges that we'd identified across the alternative protein space. And we keep running this year on year. And if you're scientists and researchers who want to be working on this and are working on some of these challenges, which are kind of seen as the biggest bottlenecks for the industry, we really encourage you to take a look at our grant program. It's also worth saying that we are always looking as a non-profit for support to help us scale this program. Again, won't dwell too long on this, but just to say, I really recommend anyone who is either already in the industry or looking to move into the industry to go to our website and take a look at the huge quantity of freely available resources we have. These are for scientists, these are for companies, these are for investors, these are for policymakers who are interested in our policy recommendations. The ones I've put here are focused more for people doing R&D, either commercially or within labs, but we offer resources for everyone. But just to spotlight on some of these, if you're a student or an educator, we have a curriculum repository where we show these are all the courses we know of globally which offer some kind of education around alternative proteins. We also have a research labs and a collaborative research directory when you can identify people who are already working on this or looking to work on this, so potential PhD supervisors or potential people you could be collaborating with. On the bottom slide, those are various different resources for you to directly help with your research itself. Okay, so just to conclude briefly, before we go to the Q&A, so just to really highlight the point that the alternative protein industry is witnessing explosive growth at this point in time. And this is incredibly exciting and promising given its power to address the various different health, environmental and food security concerns we face in feeding our population sustainably by 2050. But really for this to bear the full fruit of its potential, there are still crucial technical and scientific bottlenecks which need to be overcome, as well as a fair and favourable policy environment, which I didn't go into today, but it's something I really recommend you check out on our website as well, looking into some of the work that we're doing to make this true. On the science specifically, just going back to that previous slide, we do offer a range of different research tools, analyses, and support to scientists in the space, as well as research funding for overcoming those specific technical hurdles. Thank you very much to everyone for attending and listening, and I will open up to Q&A.
Thank you, Seren. It's been a very impactful overview of the sustainable protein space, and it's been great listening to your presentation. I believe the audience has some questions, so can I please ask the first one? Firstly, since alternative meat sources need to be produced on a large scale, how will the factories be powered? Is it a sustainable source or an NRG?
So I'll answer, just to make sure I'm clear with the question, how will we make sure that alternative proteins, when produced at scale, will be done sustainably? So yeah, I think stepping back, one important point about what alternative proteins enables us to do relative to a system which relies on animals is you're effectively electrifying the process of producing meat. So that applies especially so for cultivated. So from a plant-based perspective, growing plants, skipping animals as a kind of link of the food chain and eating plants directly is inherently more efficient and will always be more sustainable than going through animals. With cultivated meat, you're producing meat, but if you are able to electrify the process, which it inherently does, as long as your energy source is renewable, so these are the numbers that came from a techno-economic assessment, which CE Delft in the Netherlands undertook. I can't remember the exact number, but it's definitely over 90% fewer greenhouse gas emissions relative to conventional meat, and likewise much less issues around land use and water usage as well. And similarly with fermentation, it's just an incredibly efficient process, growing microbes and consuming microbes directly or utilizing ingredients from them, and therefore is always going to be above 80 or 90% more sustainable from greenhouse gas emissions or the land use questions. I'm just going to quickly turn the light on because I realize that the sun's gone down since I started speaking and I'm sitting in the dark.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. It's a very good question. So next, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's much better. Next, I have a question about plant-based meat. Which current mechanism innovation in plant-based meat is most suitable for retaining the most nutrients in the plant-based meat?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think much more research is needed to go into this. This is definitely something I would highlight as a research question we would love to see more innovation going into. But I think, I mean, off the top of my head, my sense is that the greater diversity of crop sources going in either as ingredients or into final products really maximizes the potential nutritional balance of these products. So I think moving towards more diverse crop sources and some of those questions I was highlighting around away from wheat and soy and looking at things that are native to specific countries like pea, for example, or faba bean or other things that might also reduce the need for some of the processing because they already have higher protein content, for example. That being said, I think it's still kind of worth emphasizing that plant-based foods relative to conventional meat are on most metrics going to be better for you. You don't have fecal contamination. You don't have the risk of non-communicable disease like salmonella and things. You don't have the public health issues around antibiotic resistance or potential pandemics. Yeah, and as part of a varied and well-balanced diet, they're going to be nutritionally sort of acceptable.
Yeah, thank you. I would just, as Sarah's going to be answering the last question, we're going to open a poll for you to vote on your alternative protein of preference. And as for Seren's last question, for the cellular agriculture space, which of the 4 core research areas is the most neglected currently? So which one needs most work?
I think it's a hard question to answer insofar as each of them is deeply neglected in relative terms to pretty much any other biotech research field. All of them could have so much more exciting work and kind of intelligent scientists' eyes looking at them. But looking at developing kind of cost parity with conventional meat and effective scale up, going back to that slide where we were looking at what are the key drivers, I think research that can make more efficient media optimization and can reduce the overall contribution of the media cost to the final product probably is some of the most impactful things you could be doing. But that's really not to say that innovations around scaffolding technologies and bioreactors, I mean, all of this stuff is incredibly important.
Yeah, so we need to focus on everything in order for it to work. Once again, thank you so much, Seren, for this amazing presentation. It's been really great hearing your perspective on these questions.